Hey everyone, it's me, Ori Doss at the Common Sheet. I'm your anthropologist and sociologist. Listen, mythologies won't work anymore in the 21st century. What is a mythology? A mythology is a set of stories told to either justify or to excuse the public's violence. That's all it is. Whether it's the Epic of Gilgamesh or the myth of Oedipus or the labyrinth myth, whatever mythology you can look up in history, it's all a symbolic story that does show the public's violence, but it conceals it by blaming the victim. Let's think about the story of Oedipus. This guy was abandoned by his parents. When he's a grown man, he decides to attack a Greek city, kill the king, and marry the king's wife, to marry the queen, so he becomes the new king. He impregnates the widow of the king he just killed, and she gives birth to his baby. Later finds out that the woman he married, namely the widow of the man he killed, is actually his mom, and the man he killed was his dad. So Oedipus is accused of fratricide and incest. So his two crimes trigger anger from the public, and people claim that he caused a famine in the community. They kill Oedipus, and the famine is resolved. Now, likely this story didn't actually happen in this exact way. Maybe something similar like that happened in history. But what the story shows is that there was a famine, so somewhere the public failed in agriculture, and as a result, there were people dying of hunger. Now, people had to live with this failure, and the people that died of hunger will not come back. So people have to deal with the losses. Now, maybe it wasn't directly the failure of the public. Maybe there was a lot of bad weather out of the blue. But even then, they could have prepared to import um, bread or other stuff from other nations. But anyway, there's a bad situation people have to deal with. And one thing about fallen mankind is all about escaping, seeking relief, and being left alone. Dealing with life challenges is not something fallen mankind is interested into. However, there's no choice but to deal with life challenges. So anytime there's a challenge or anytime there's a difficulty that people in the world don't want to deal with, but they have no choice but to deal with it, they have to act against their will, act against their volition, act against their interests. With interest, I don't mean what actually works well for them. Means what they're interested in. Anytime this happens, it generates psychological stress. This psychological stress will harm both their own mind and the minds of others, and will also harm their physical bodies. So the unrest, when it accumulates, it will bring forth harm. Now, the public now needs to offload this unrest, or else unrest will finish them off mentally as well as physically. So to reduce the amount of mental disorders and to reduce the amount of physical sicknesses that will develop from this unrest, and also to reduce the incidence of domestic violence, as well as public meltdowns of violence. Because if the unrest is not discharged off, it will lead to series of mental breakdowns, mental disorders, physical sicknesses, as well as people when they lose their mind, they act out in violent ways, public violent meltdowns, as well as domestic violence. And if you're dealing with pregnant women, pregnant women or children and their adults lose their mind is not a good situation. So, to limit such outbursts of the unrest, the public now craves for one victim or one group of people to focus all the unrest upon. Then they ventilate their unrest on that individual, they kill that individual or they massacre that group. Everyone feels relieved. Everyone has released the unrest and life continues. And because the public was in unrest for a little while, now the old unrest has been discharged. To them, it feels almost heavily, like great peace has come over them. It's not actual peace, because the unrest will grow back, but still, for the moment, people are at ease again. They're calm again. And that's how fallen mankind operates. But now, this is an enormous defect in fallen mankind. But this is not a defect fallen mankind can fix about themselves. Only the Heavenly Father can, and Heavenly Father laid out His plan for salvation. So mankind has to submit to the Heavenly Father's plan of salvation, which will require their surrender and them following His lead. But following the Heavenly Father's lead includes owning up to the situation that they can't save themselves nor redeem themselves, also owning up that they have to manage themselves and one another. These are all things fallen mankind doesn't want to do. They just want a quick fix, be left alone, continue in ease, act like nothing happened. That's fallen mankind. So, this thing called society, which the Bible calls the world, can only function if there is either a proposed justification. I said proposed because you cannot justify it. There must be a proposed justification or genuine accepted excuse for the public's bullshit. Simple as that. Now, of course, even in ancient times, individuals couldn't just act out and blame someone else for them acting out, because nobody would take it. However, when the whole community is soaked in unrest, it's going to be hard to hold people accountable. If one or two people lose their mind and they go crazy, you can arrest them, put them in prison, or you can execute them, or put them in a mental asylum. If you have 100 people losing their mind, it's going to be more difficult to deal with it. If it's 500 people, you won't be able to deal with it. If it's 1,000 people or 10,000 people, my God, they need an outlet. So, in ancient times, they fabricated these stories based on real events. The mythologies of ancient times were based on real events that happened, the real instances when the public had a giant meltdown, and to prevent them from turning one another, they turned on people who were too weak to fight back. Now, this is wrong, this is evil, you can't justify this. However, is this organized murder? Is this organized homicide that brought relief to the masses? And mythologies are there to either attempt to justify or to grant a convincing excuse on why it happens. Now, you cannot afford as a community to continuously offload and kill victims, because at some point there will be nobody left. So that's why in ancient times, when societies were established, they came with restrictions, codes of behavior to limit the probability of people turning on one another. Those hierarchical differences, those archaic hierarchical differences, were meant to limit outbreaks of violence. So, fallen mankind has the plague that they have to contain their own unrest. They have to contain the violence that comes with unrest too, because the violence is the outlet for that unrest. So, fallen mankind cannot rid itself from its unrest, it's inevitable, but they can regulate how the unrest plays out. So society has always been about regulating violence. It cannot eliminate nor exterminate violence. It can only regulate violence by deciding what violence is allowed, what is not allowed. And then they put policing authorities to make sure people get along with the restrictions. Now, those restrictions, again, are not meant to solve the unrest in fallen mankind because fallen mankind cannot solve this by themselves. So, society can only work if the mythology works. Without the mythology, people will see through the cowardice of the masses quickly. They won't be convinced by the excuse nor the proposed justification, and people will not feel comfortable participating in the bloodshed. Society only works when everyone participates in the bloodshed. People have to believe the victim is guilty. Now, the victim itself doesn't have to be fully innocent. The victim can be a criminal, or they can be an adulterer, or someone that's antisocial, whatever. The victim can also be people who actually didn't do anything wrong to the community. For example, young children or whatever, or a foreigner who just is passing by, who had nothing to do with all the conflicts in the community. The thing is, it doesn't matter whether the victim is actually guilty or not. Now, if the victim is to blame because of some character defect, hey, that's even better because now they can use the character defects of the victim against the victim. But just like in the story of Oedipus, even if Oedipus was such a horrible man that he killed his own father and slept with his own mom, that does not mean that his character defects caused the famine and all the harm happened to the people. That's not true. That's a lie. It's a hoax. However, as long as people are convinced and believe that Oedipus is the one who caused all the problems, people will feel and consider it just to take it out on him. And as long as they believe this, eventually the fact will work. The bloodshed, the collective bloodshed will work, and people will obtain that ease again. Things will calm down. There's a reduction of domestic violence, reduction of mental breakdowns, reduction of public meltdowns. So it works. Calmed, the community is calm again. There's temporarily a little bit of harmony back in the community. So for the organized bloodshed to work, people must be in agreement with the bloodshed. They have to believe that the bloodshed is justified. Even if there's proof it can't be justified, it doesn't matter. It's people have to believe it. And if there's false evidence that supports the bloodshed, even the better. So the most important thing here is to make sure that the victim is not hurt. Nobody should be speaking on behalf of the victim, because the moment you have people speaking on behalf of the victim and showing proof of how insane the whole situation is, guess what? The organized bloodshed will not work. It may even be more unrest. So in ancient times, they did develop a court system, but even then, the court system served as a ritual to regulate the organized bloodshed of the masses. It was the gospel that exposed this cowardice of all mankind. And let me tell you, little by little, the gospel turned organized bloodshed, organized blood sacrifice, and made it ineffective. Look, in the first century, when Christ was crucified and resurrected, the blood sacrifice system of the world still functioned very well, even though it began to crumble little by little. In the 4th century, the effectiveness already decreased a lot. Going in the, let's say, 18th and 19th century, it was at maybe 20% of its effectiveness. Now, in the 21st century, where due to instant communication and technology, everyone with a device in their hand can have access to news, what goes on at the other side of the world, in combination with the gospel being spread everywhere. Organized bloodshed's effectiveness is at maybe 2% or even less. Thing is, it's like a drug. If you have a drug addict, in the beginning of their addiction, they only need maybe a little bit of cocaine to get their high. Several years later, they need a big amount of cocaine to get the same little high. And the more cocaine they take, the more they damage their own body. Now, if the gospel never happened, if Christ never came, the effectiveness of organized bloodshed would stay the same. Because there was no universal belief in the value of human life and no universal belief in things like human rights, the right for human beings to have life, safety, and all of that. Human life was valued based on how much people could get out of a human life. So things like killing off elderly people because they were too costly, it was a horrible thing, and there were human beings who were upset with it, but hey, what else could you do? Or killing little children or babies when parents didn't want to deal with parenthood. It's something that happened even in ancient Rome. In ancient Rome, there was a square where people would bring the children they don't want to look after anymore, and the children would become orphans. Why they had things like this? Because when people don't, let's say you have parents who don't want to be parents anymore, they regret having children. Well, guess what? They have nothing to want or to feel. Their parents don't have to deal with the children. Thing is, they'll have the tendency to abuse those children, and once the children are older, that abuse their children suffered, they'll be damaged adults, and now the whole community has to deal with those damaged adults, which will be costly, which will be humiliating and embarrassing. And that also can lead to other conflicts, especially if the children remember how the community didn't intervene when the parents were going off at them. So to prevent the community later to have to go to all this embarrassment, they would allow parents to abandon their children. They would allow parents to even kill their children at times. Now, doesn't mean everyone back then agree with this, no. But those were things that happened. What I'm saying is, mythology worked in ancient times. Mythology is satanic and it worked. 21st century, it doesn't work anymore. If mythology worked, you wouldn't have as much of bloodshed and social unrest like you have today in the world. Because when organized bloodshed, mythology is to make organized bloodshed effective. When mythology works, people remain comfortable and calm in the long run when they participate in the bloodshed. Of course, there will be some mental distress because they're actually agreeing to harm a defenseless human being, but hey, the collective justification numbs down this feeling of guilt and they can continue. Though to the gospel now, mythology being less effective, people cannot easily look the other way without it harming them mentally, emotionally, even eventually physically. So in ancient times, you could kill maybe 2 or 3 people or a small family, and the whole city would be at ease for at least 2 or 3 years maybe. Then you have another incident and it happens again, it will continue. Today, you would have to kill a few hundred people to get the same effect. And because you don't always have a few hundred people to kill, without it damaging the community, People use substitutes like wars abroad. They use visual media like TV to keep offering people this narcissistic supply of looking down on people worse off than them. Because that is what mainstream media often does. It grants narcissistic supply to the masses by showing them how worse off other people are. That's a virtual substitute for actually doing the killing in real life. But it serves the same purpose. But again, though to social media, mainstream media is challenged. So that doesn't work as well anymore. It comes down to this. Fallen mankind craves Satanism. They crave this excuse to go off at defenseless victims just so they don't have to deal with themselves. That's fallen mankind. They don't want to admit this about themselves because this is not something good. This is not something honorable, and it's not something they can justify. Because nobody would be okay it happening to them or one of their loved ones. So why is it okay to do it to someone else? Mythology was their quote-unquote solution. Mythologies were there to either offer proposed justification or a convincing excuse for the masses. When those don't work, the unrest will ferment, increase, and lead to more and more conflict. So eventually, the world won't be able to contain violence anymore because unrest is all over the place. And that's where we are now in human history. The only way out is for people to submit to Christ, follow his guidance, be renewed in the mind, and improve internally. That's the only way. Any other way is just a fleeting bailout that will backfire on them. Simple as that. So mythologies don't work in the 21st century. And they won't work after this 21st century either. It's over. Christ is one. Follow him. He's the way, the truth, and the life. Be at peace.